It's a good show.
Hello and welcome to Humans Who Make Games, an intimate, personal conversation with the people who created some of our favorite video games. I'm Adam Conover, and this episode is a little bit of a change of pace. Usually on this show, we talk to game designers, but if you play video games, and I assume you do if you're listening to this show, you know that there's a lot more art that goes into a video game than just how it plays, right? There's the visuals, there's the writing, and, critically, there's the music. Often, it's the music that really defines the feel of a game and makes it stick in our memories years later. Well, if you've ever played a game featuring the music of today's guest, you know exactly what I'm talking about. His name is Rich Vreeland, also known as Disasterpeace, and you might know him from the incredible music he composed for games like Fez, Hyper Light Drifter, and the film It Follows. In this interview, we talk about the chiptune scene where Rich first started, his experience composing for Fez, and the thought process he uses to compose music that gives players the exact feeling he and the game designer are looking for. Also, if you're enjoying our theme music, that's Rich as well. This is Humans Who Make Games, and please enjoy this interview with Rich Vreeland. Rich, thank you so much for being here.
Happy to be here.
So you compose music as Disasterpeace.
Mm-hmm.
You have worked on such games as Fez, Hyper Light Drifter. You worked on It Follows.
Mm-hmm.
I will begin the interview, as I often do, with this question. What is your first memory of video games?
My first memory, well, this probably doesn't count, but apparently my parents were playing Legend of Zelda while I was in the womb.
Oh my God, really?
Yeah, so that must have seeped in somehow. But my
mom was playing the accordion while I was in the womb. That was the only thing she ever told me.
That explains a lot.
And the accordion's like right up next to where the baby's head is. You
Right,
know?
right.
You play it on the stomach.
Yeah, you don't even need to hold it.
Yeah.
If you got the...
And that's why I became such a big
belly.
Weird Al fan.
Oh.
I mean, it could be.
Interesting.
Did you? So were they were game players as a kid?
I believe so. Although by the time I was old enough to be sentient, they weren't playing games anymore, really. So actually, that's not entirely true. My dad would play with me from time to time. But yeah, I remember growing up like playing a lot of sports games, football games. I remember this game Tecmo Super Bowl for the Nintendo.
Oh yeah, very famous.
Which was like really popular with my family. My dad and my dad's cousins all were like super into this game, and they would like play it really intensely.
That's a game that people still play intensely. Like
it's like it has like a kind of like a cult following, and people mod the game with like updated rosters, and they have like tournaments, and it's one of those kind of games.
It's got like a Smash Melee kind of thing where it's like people still want to play that exact game.
It's in that upper echelon of like legendary sports games.
Yeah.
Up there with like NHL 94, which is another one that people still play and like mod and do all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So it's just a really good game. That.
Did your parents beat Legend of Zelda? Do you have any idea?
I should ask them. I don't know.
I'm so fascinated. I'm so fascinated when I hear because I was too young to play the original Legend of Zelda. The first Zelda that I played properly was Link to the Past, which is totally different. But I'm always so fascinated by the story of people playing the Legend of Zelda because of all of the we had to make our own maps, and it was like we had to figure out what to do, and it was the level of mystery in that game and like inscrutability of it must have been so huge. And it's like seemed like it required a level of patience that people wouldn't even have now for a game.
Yeah.
But just because it was one of the first games that was like that, it was like really transfixing. It's like you can't reproduce the experience of playing that game in 1980, whatever year it was.
Well, I think that's like for me. I played like my parents had an NES, and then when they split when I was like 3, my dad kept the NES, and he had it for a while, and I played it as a kid, but I was older. You know, I was like. It was like 1992 or something, 1993, and I was playing the NES. And like, so I didn't have a lot of friends that had an NES. You know, they were like I didn't really start playing games with friends until, it was Super Nintendo at that time. Mm-hmm. So like I played Legend of Zelda as a kid, but I was playing it by myself. And I kind of imagine like it must have been different to play it like when it came out with your friends and you're all like kind of pooling together to try to solve it and do the maps and all that. But I was just playing by myself, and I just found it like infuriatingly difficult.
Yeah.
And I had no help, so.
Yeah, I mean, when I played, I mean, I had, I knew people with the cartridge. I borrowed the cartridge. I tried to play it, and I was just like, I can't do this.
Yeah, this is like for professionals.
Yeah, what does this game expect of you?
And it doesn't get any easier, as games get more and more sort of like accessible, quote unquote.
Yeah. It was this weird kind of I still think people talk about how wonderful that game was that you didn't know anything about it, but I still think the fact that you would have to go burn every bush on the goddamn map to find one of the dungeons, that it was just like burn a random bush and you'll find a dungeon, is like, that's bad. I don't think that's good design,
No, I don't think so either. Kind of arbitrary.
Well, it's really funny because normally when we do this podcast, I talk to people about video games, and I always sort of try to track through and like how they came to video games. But how did you come to do music as a I'm always interested in. Because I was a musical kid. I taught myself to play the guitar in high school. I sang, I played piano, stuff like that. But I never stepped over the boundary of thinking, oh, this is something I could do professionally.
Right.
Which I did do with comedy, and I actually even had the thought like recently that I was like, man, I think in college I was about as funny as I was a good musician,
Right.
But for some reason I was like, no, I'm kidding myself with that. I shouldn't bother. I'll do comedy. And so I'm always interested in how that step happens.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. Like you said, I think sometimes as a kid, you kind of like hit this like fork where you kind of have to make a choice about what you're going to do. And that happened for me because I was in school as a graphic designer, and I kind of decided to bail on that and do music. But growing up, I played games as a kid, and I got into music sort of ambiently because my family were all musicians. My mom and my stepfather were like involved with the music ministry at our church and stuff. And so they would have like band practice in the basement and stuff. There were drums around, and I didn't really play. I would just like sneak down there and like, screw around.
Yeah.
Basically for many years. But over time, I think I just developed sort of like my own weird sort of internal musicality. Like I'd clack on my teeth and like I'd be like slapping out rhythms on my belly. So that by the time I kind of made a decision, like I think I want to play an instrument. I picked up guitar in high school, and I felt like it felt natural to me to play. And so I kind of got into it really quickly and just like found that I had all these like ideas. And once I discovered like recording and just like finding ways to put your ideas down, I just like went crazy, basically.
That's so. Well, I mean, that blows my mind a little bit because almost everything you said like tracks with my actual own life story. Like my folks, we were all in the church choir, and so we all sang. My parents were in a contra dance band. They ran a successful. I don't know if you know what that is.
No.
It's like a form of folk dancing. It's superficially similar to square dancing. If you were to imagine square dancing, you wouldn't be far off, but it has sort of a different lineage. And so they played. My dad played guitar. My mom played accordion, and like called these dances, and they would be in these big barns, and people would do, and they were like successful at it. They were like toured around Long Island and like Massachusetts and places like that. It's folk music,
Yeah.
And I picked up guitar in high school, and then I remember being in college and like just sort of playing around with like recording software, and then. But I think the place where I get off is that where I get off that train is like having musical ideas. Like I didn't feel like I actually. I mean, the kid, some songwriting and stuff like that. But I was mostly just noodling around, occasionally expanding something out. But like, what did that? What sort of form did that take, or what did that feel like?
Well, for me, from a very young age, I spent a lot of time alone, kind of screwing around in my room, like drawing or like inventing weird things, or like pretending to own a company and making logos that don't matter, or like writing stories, just basically doing anything to like entertain myself. And so that, there was a natural progression for me from that to, whatever it was that I was doing, whether it was graphic design or whether it was music or whatnot. So, and then being surrounded by musicians, I think it kind of just seeped into me in a way that, when I actually like started doing it, I had this sort of like backlog, or like I was just like bursting at the seams with like excitement to like be creative and like to actually like make music. Especially like having, listened to music for a while at that point, and just the idea of like I could make something and put it out there and share it with other people, like with the internet and everything.
Yeah.
Once I was actually releasing music and getting feedback from people, even if it was like, oh, this is terrible.
Yeah.
It didn't even matter what the feedback was. I was just hooked on the idea of I make something and then people tell me what they think of it.
Yeah.
I just thought that was so wild. So
that is how I felt about comedy. Like when my friend started a sketch comedy group in college, I was like, oh yeah, I want to do that. And like I would like to, I never had thought about it before that, but yes, I would like to write these and I want to perform them and see how they do. And like, oh, here's a thing that would be fun, like, and then that process of like, whenever people say, oh, how do you get into comedy or anything or anything? My advice is always just like, oh, just start creating and then put it in front of people and get the reaction and then go and then learn something from that and go off of that. That's like, and if you're actually like hooked on that loop, then you're going to naturally get better.
Yeah, no, totally. I think it helps you to kind of interface with reality a little bit, because it just gives you, okay, this is kind of what people are getting from my music. This is, I don't know. It's just kind of part of that process of like going from kind of like the void, or sort of like the, like the dream world, into like reality, like actually doing something and having it out there.
Yeah. The doing is like so much the important part. Mm-hmm. Like you can think about it forever.
Because I know so many talented people who don't release a lot of their stuff, or they don't share it. And I think that's a process that everyone who's creative, like you go through that process to grow to be comfortable with releasing material. And I don't think it ever ends. Like I think, like for me, it's actually gotten harder recently to release material, because I feel like I keep trying to set a bar for myself higher and higher, and so it gets harder to actually, like reach that bar sometimes.
You release a ton of stuff though. Like you've got, on like Bandcamp and places like that, it's like as long as your arm.
Yeah, for sure. But I mean, that's over many, many years. That's
right.
Like, it's like over 10 years now, 11, 12 years of material.
Well, so when you're, when you say you were releasing stuff on the internet, where was that?
So that was like, so when I was a teenager, I was one of these sort of like, kind of creative things that I would do in my spare time was this thing called e-wrestling.
I've never heard of this.
It's not like other esports. It's more like role playing. It's like creative writing. You create a fictional wrestler character, and you write stories.
This is the greatest thing I've ever heard. This is, as soon as you started describing it, I was like, the joy of finding about this is on the internet.
Yeah.
The joy of discovering a new internet subculture.
Yeah.
I'm so excited about this. Please go on.
It's just one of these weird internet things that was around. When I was like, I probably started doing this in the year 2000 maybe. So I was like 13 or 14. And I was I was always like somewhat interested in wrestling. I used to watch my dad's like VHS tapes of like SummerSlam '87 and stuff. Like I just watched them over and over again, because that was we didn't have money to get pay-per-view anymore, so we just watched the same videos. But so when I kind of discovered this thing, that there are all these like kids, on like the on like a GeoCities, or like one of these like with these sites from like the late 90s, early 2000s, where you just make a message board for free.
Yeah.
There were all these like communities where people would like start their own, they called it an e-fed, which is just like a wrestling quote unquote federation.
Yeah.
It's just like a group of people, a couple of people who are like running this fed, who are like writing. They basically schedule out the event, quote unquote events, which are like, like once a week or twice a week, there's some kind of event, sort of like the WWF would have, where there's like, they pit people against each other. They have like championship matches and all this kind of stuff. And so you spend a week or whatever, you know who you're going to fight at the end of the week. And you spend the week writing these role plays, which are like, you just post like, I don't know. You just post a story about your character, or your character's being interviewed by a fictional,
Yeah.
like a guy, one of those like wrestling guys with the tuxedo.
Yeah.
I was like,
and
"No,
then-
tell me about your whatever, you know.
And yeah, you say, I'm mad at this guy for whatever reason. You write that out.
But like over time, like when I first started, I remember it was really primitive. But then as I did it more and more, I think I felt like the people doing it were getting older together. And so it started getting more like sophisticated.
Yeah.
And like in the beginning, it was all just like, you just write a whole lot and whoever writes the most pretty much wins. But then over time, they started like, people started doing things like creating feds where it's called an angle fed. And what that meant was like your character had an angle and it was all like predetermined who would win. It was just determined by the people who ran the thing. So we would try to like craft these like elaborate, sort of like storylines that would take place over time.
They're trying to get good at like wrestling writing, basically.
Yeah, I guess so.
Wow.
Yeah.
How did they determine? I mean, like, are you writing like a move, and then the other person's like writing their response, or
no? So during the week, you would you might do a promo, which is like you're in the arena during the week preparing for your match, and you're just talking trash.
Yep.
You might do like more of like a threaded story where you're out in the world, and it's just like backstory for your character. Like the history of your character or interacting with different people. And it all sort of like would all lead to some sort of like conclusion that would have some sort of relevance to either the feud that you're having with the character or, a feud that you might be having with some of the characters who were created by the Federation, who are like staff or whatever.
yeah.
And so you might
NPCs.
be putting out, yeah, exactly. So you might be putting out like like you might be doing like, I don't know, like a 6-part role play or something. And then so, as like a teenager, getting really pumped up for the end of the week when, you're just waiting Sunday morning for the results to come out. And the results are like this like 15-page like play, basically.
Oh, wow.
And it's just like in great detail, like the moment to moment of this like fictional wrestling event that you're taking.
So the sorry. I got a little water in the wrong spot. So the people running it are sort of, they're writing the results, they're writing the actual match itself.
Right, exactly.
Wow.
So you don't know what's going to happen. You don't know if you won or not. And it all unfolds like you're reading it like line by line, and my heart was like racing, like, oh my God, I hope I win.
This is not what you came here to talk about, but I have so many more questions. How did this come about? I mean, do you know, was this just like a wrestling message board, and then people just started like doing a little free writing, and then someone was like, oh, what if we You
know how I think I might have found it? Because I was doing fantasy sports, like fantasy football and fantasy basketball. I think I was watching wrestling at the time, and I just probably searched for fantasy wrestling, and this came up, and I was like, this is not what I expected, but it sounds really interesting. So I tried it, and I did it for a year. I did it for like probably like four years.
Wow.
And actually, the reason that I brought it up is because, that getting involved in that community, I started, it became like, it had like a little economy that was attached to it because it's a community, and they're like people, they wanted to, when they would post their role plays on the message board, they'd usually post like an HTML thing or whatever, and people wanted it to look pretty. So there were like designated people who were like, oh, that's like the graphics person who's like really good at graphics, or like the person who's really good at music. You want to have like some entrance, quote unquote, entrance music in your role play HTML.
So people were making like custom HTML files for
people
these.
were making like their own websites, like for fictional wrestlers. And so I was, my mom is a graphic designer, and from a very young age, I was always like drawing and like making fictional logos and doing all this kind of stuff. And I got into HTML, like even before the wrestling stuff. I was like, I made like a Super Mario RPG like fan website when I was like 10.
Oh, that's awesome.
So like,
it's not still up anywhere?
I really wish it was.
Is it on archive.org?
I couldn't find it. I really wish I could, because
my first webpage is also not. I can't find it anywhere. I can picture it perfectly. It was just Adam Conover's homepage. That's all it was, and it was just silly stuff I liked. But I can picture it, and I wish I could see it for real again, but I can't. I remember it so vividly that I took sort of like a historian's approach
to like deconstructing Super Mario RPG into all these individual text files. Just like really nerdy stuff. But that was how I like entertained myself. But yeah, I mean, so I started doing like graphics and websites for these like, you know, wrestling characters and stuff and getting paid like $20 or whatever.
Oh, wow. They're paying each other.
Yeah. And it was a global sort of community. So I was getting like, you know, I'm like, imagine I'm like 14 or 15 and my mom's like, you got a letter from Malta. I'm like, oh, I know who that is. She's like, what the hell's going on? So I was like getting like checks and stuff. And that like kind of started me on this like path of being a freelancer. And when I got into music, I, you know, would like post music on some of these message boards. And that's how I got my first gig doing video game music.
Really? Just posting music on message boards?
Because there was a guy who ran like a software company that was making cell phone games. And he posted a wanted ad, and I submitted some music that I'd written.
Wow. You know, a good friend of mine is the TV composer Jesse Novak, who does, and he used to do chiptunes under the name Tugboat. I don't know.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah. You remember it?
I'm familiar with Tugboat.
Yeah.
I didn't realize he was doing TV music.
Yeah, he does music on BoJack Horseman, and he did the theme song for Superstore and a bunch of other things.
Oh, crazy.
Yeah, and we were in
Small world.
We were in a sketch group together.
Oh, wow.
Called Old English for many years. And I remember after we got out of college, his first gig was making cell phone music, and it was like, and he knew at the time. I remember him telling me it's this really brief period between when cell phones couldn't have ringtones and then when they could play actual music. And there was a time when you needed to make like polyphonic, I think it was
like MIDI files.
MIDI files, yeah.
That's the exact same time that I started doing it.
Yeah, that's
because it was pre-smartphone, so I had to do music and sound effects all using general MIDI sounds. So like, you know, like the early 90s, like keyboards have like 127 different sounds.
Yeah.
It's like flutes and pianos and like this like canned gunshot and like a canned helicopter sound.
I didn't know those were part of the MIDI spec.
So you had to use these like canned sounds to like make, like I worked on like a zombie game and I had to make like the sound of like a chainsaw, and I used like a distorted guitar, like just like playing really quickly or something. But it was just a really weird kind of time and space.
Wow. And then so I assume at some point you got, because in the mid 2000s I listened to a lot of like music from like the chiptune scene.
Yeah.
Which was, well, so I assume you were in those circles as well?
Yeah, that's right around the time I started getting involved in that stuff. I kind of came at it more from, it sounds like you might have been familiar with the New York scene, like the 8-bit peoples folks.
Can we describe what chiptunes are real quick for folks who don't know?
Chiptunes is music that was written with or inspired by old video game hardware, basically.
And the cool thing about it for me was, it was like right in the pocket of, you know, people my age who grew up with actual video game music.
Right.
And then, you know, in my mid-20s and or early 20s, and people are starting to make new music in that style. And more importantly, using the original hardware as a synthesizer.
Right.
Like a big part of it was like the music is literally being made on a Game Boy that's been hacked, or using custom software to let you use the Game Boy chip. But so that was a lot like, you know, it was me at the time. I realized like, oh, like these chips are like the Moog synthesizer, or like any other sort of instrument that has like you can do cool shit with.
Totally.
And there's the 8-bit people scene in New York they did Blip Fest. I went to a bunch of those.
Me too. I played at one.
Oh yeah?
Yeah, 2011, 2010, maybe I played.
I think I went in like 2006 or something like that.
Oh wow.
So they went for a little while.
For a while, like 10 years or something, they did that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, so that was like, and it was a real like sort of, I heard the term net label a while ago for like people who like, you know, like internet record labels, like.
But it's primarily focused on digital releases.
Yeah.
There might be physical, but it's not the focus so much. And it's a lot of free material.
Yeah, and
typically.
and 8-Bit Peoples was one of those, and I would go on, and I would literally just be like, okay, what's new? Like they would just, musicians around the world would basically just send them MP3s, and they would put them on their website and like assign it a record label number.
Yeah, but it's like a real label in the sense that it's all curated.
Yeah,
and I actually co-ran another net label that was fairly prominent at the time, like probably 2007, a little later, 2007 to like. Was it 2007? Yeah, 2007 to like 2011 or 12, and we put out like 100 or 150 albums.
Oh, wow. What was it called?
It's called Pause.
Huh.
iimusic.net. We put out a bunch of stuff. And actually, like, there's probably like 10 or 15 artists that are on 8-Bit Peoples that also released on,
oh, really?
on our net label. I ran it with Iduk Suka, who I kind of came up with doing like chiptunes and being interested in video game music. And we both kind of crossed over into games. And he wrote the music for Spelunky.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and a bunch of other games too.
For the modern Spelunky. That's awesome.
Yeah.
So, and did you get into that just the same way through just like, hey, message boards and?
Yeah, through a couple of different message boards, because around that time, I was just kind of discovering people doing fan music. I discovered this website called Metroid Metal. Which is like prog rock versions of Metroid stuff, and it was, I mean, I was just like, wet my pants over excitement with that as like a 16-year-old or whatever. But I met a lot of people through that, and I started, there was a pretty sizable community of musicians who were interested in it and would post music, and so it was kind of a creators community. Yeah. And there was another one called The Shiz, which was a message board for bands based out of Arizona. Huh. And there was a board for each band, and I think one above the others was like got super popular. It was the message board for the Mini Bosses.
Oh yeah, I remember the Mini Bosses.
So same thing, like a really creative community, like a lot of people interested in music.
Were you from Arizona at the time? Is that what?
No, I just found the Mini Bosses.
You just were hanging out on the message board for bands in Arizona.
Yeah, just as someone does in the early age of the internet. But
the Mini Bosses, they played like, am I right? They were like a sort of like a rock 3-piece that played.
Yeah, 3 or 4 piece, kind of like a hard rock, almost stoner rock sort of.
And they
video
played
game music
covers of video game
covers.
Music.
Yeah, exactly. But I mean, there was like crossover between those two communities, and like through that, I discovered people doing chiptunes, which I didn't know was a thing. Yeah. Until about 2004, I think.
I
blew my mind.
I loved it so much because I like that stuff too, like they're like the remixes and the people doing the covers of the things. But then when it was people making new music,
that's what really interested me more.
Of the style that like the same melodic lines, the same way of writing a melody, the same kind of like instrumentation, but better, or just with really a focus on that, like sometimes it would be, like, I'd hear it and I'd be like, well, this sounds. When they would use the chip like really strictly, sometimes it'd be like just more like technically complex than someone was actually doing with the Game Boy in the 80s. It's like, okay, now they're really like push it to its limit, or it would be the same kind of music but with
modern tools.
Modern tools, exactly.
Yeah, and sometimes it was both of those things because there were pieces of software built to make it way easier to write, like Nintendo, like NES music that you could actually play back on a Nintendo, but with a far more sophisticated piece of music, like sequencing software. Like back in the 80s, they would have used like a machine language kind of thing.
That's wild. They're literally programming the music with machine language.
Yeah. There was some other thing. I mean, they were figuring it out, so it was much more primitive and kind of crazy. And there was a lot of like, in the beginning, programmers doing all the sound because they were the only ones who could understand how to do it. Or, a lot of composers would just send like a cassette tape with the music, and the programmer might have to like transcribe it. Like,
wow.
This is crazy.
But some of the things that people would do, I mean, I saw you like turn your head at me a little bit when I said, "Oh, well, it was better in the chiptune era," and my interpretation of that is I don't want to throw shade on anybody from the past.
Oh well, I was just thinking that, and for me, it kind of feels almost like this discovery of like people using this old technology. It kind of would fulfill this like fantasy of like, what would it be? What would it have been like to have been one of these like, like Japanese like video game composers from the 80s? Kind of like grafting yourself onto history in a weird way and like fantasizing about it. And like a few of my early albums were like concept albums where I was like imagining like a fictitious game. Like that was something that was really kind of motivated me.
Yeah.
I don't know.
I remember one of the ones that we'll stop talking about other people's work after this, maybe. But like Vert's albums at the time, really got to me because he was doing like stuff that sounded specifically like Konami games and like using the NES, chip in this way that made me more aware of the amazing work that people did in like Castlevania games that I had actually played. But then I would listen and go, oh, the drums sound like this, and they're creating, sort of a staccato sound like that, and like, oh, this is why that's cool. Yeah. And then, he's like literally, sort of like reproducing the moods from different games or from different feelings, but in a new, in a new context.
He's always been a master at like sort of deconstructing these different styles and kind of reconstructing them, where you very clearly get that sense of the style, but also you get a really clear sense of his musicality and his style. Actually, a lot of those Konami inspired albums, he actually did them with like a tracker, I think, like a modern piece of software. But then later he actually did, I think he did more of the authentic NES stuff. But he was composing for games for a long time, so he was doing Game Boy music soundtracks in like 1992.
Really?
And
I didn't
he's
know that.
like not that much older than I am.
Wow.
But he's working a long time.
But it almost seemed like there was a moment where that sound and style started to like permeate its way outside of the video game fandom and subculture. I remember like Beck put out like an EP with a bunch of remixes on it, and
the Guero EP.
Yeah, and then you started to hear like that sound, and I still hear that sound sometimes, but it's been really cool the way it's sort of like diffused out, and like now it's like part of the wider musical vocabulary. Exactly. And it was like, but that was a period where people were like, okay, let's do that exactly and like really directly, and here it is precisely. Yeah. And then now it's just like it's just
part of the culture. Yeah. There for a long time there was a lot of discussion like when is like the chiptune sound going to become like super mainstream and super popular. Yeah. And I feel like that never really happened. It would just like pop culture was always flirting with it they started to flirt with it quite a bit in like the mid 2000s. Yeah. And I think like you said, it just kind of became like a part of the vocabulary. It never really like hit this fever pitch of like, oh no, everyone's doing this.
Yeah, like it was never like, oh, suddenly like every rapper is doing like chiptune beats or whatever, but like occasionally you hear it, or something like Steven Universe, for instance, has a lot of very chippy sounds in its
Right. Well, the
scoring.
composers are from that community.
Oh, really? Well, there you go. But it feels very natural. It's not like, oh, here we're doing this video game thing. It's just like, oh yeah, of course. Like if you want a particular feeling and a particular sort of, childlike wonder, alien landscapes, but also there's a little bit of nostalgia thrown in. Like it evokes as an instrument all those things the way a cello invokes a different set of associations.
Yeah. It's I was going to say a couple of things. There a lot of popular artists, well-known artists, actually started in like the demo scene community, which was like the like late '80s, early '90s, and I think through till now. Creating these like sort of like tech demos of like art and music. Yeah.
The demo scene's wild.
Yeah, I mean it's kind of like a adjacent to the chip scene, I would say, and like. Yeah, there are quite a few like well-known musicians who kind of came from that. So it's almost like there's like a
well-known like mainstream musicians.
Yeah, there's sort of like a subtle. I don't know. I think every once in a while it kind of comes out in their music, maybe, but
that's
not
really...
intentionally or not. not
Yeah.
overtly, but I mean, it's just a part of history, especially the history of electronic music,
Right.
because it was such a big, popular sort of scene, especially in Europe.
Yeah. Do you think before we like move on to your work after this, do you feel that those sort of communities like the demo scene, which is just that was just people competing to like who could make their Commodore 64 do the craziest shit,
Right.
or like e-wrestling,
In like the smallest size possible.
yeah, exactly. Like I'm gonna make the dopest track I can in like 1 kilobyte
With
or
3D graphics. Just nuts.
yeah, that's just crazy. Or like e-wrestling, or the chiptune community, right? Where
Yeah.
it's like these little, vibrant communities of creative people who are, really, really a scene. I remember. I feel like maybe I've talked about this on the show before, but I read in David Byrne's book on music. He talks about like
Right.
what you need for a scene. Like which is a place where people are putting up work, new work all the time, and everyone is watching each other's work and like sort of discussing it, right?
Right.
And that makes a scene, and that makes more creativity come out. And so, and these scenes are like existing on message boards and these weird little websites. It feels like, is that something that's still happening on the internet?
It feels like it's. I feel like I'm talking about it more and more in the past tense.
Yeah.
I mean, there are some of those sites that were part of the chiptune scene still exist,
Right.
And I can't speak too strongly to it because I've always been more of a transient kind of artist. Like I found myself in different scenes at different times, and I know people who are still doing chiptune stuff for like 20 years or something.
Wow.
But that hasn't been me. But from my perspective, I do feel like the culture of the internet has changed quite a bit, and there's not much of those like weird sort of disparate communities as there used to be.
I just think so much about how, we all thought at the time that the internet was like a new thing, but it was going to be that way forever.
Right.
And we didn't realize how much the culture of it was going to change as new people joined it and as it got bigger and as it began to consolidate.
Yeah, I think consolidation is really a key point of that. Like everything sort of got kind of intermeshed and connected, especially as like these companies started to come up with like that had technology that was useful to people. Like for me and like being a net label, like running a net label, when Bandcamp came out, like it was hard to keep doing the net label thing because here was a service that was doing a lot of what we were doing, but doing it better.
Yeah.
Except for really like the community aspect, like the actual like communication. And so that sort of just like fell by the wayside. And I think the social network stuff I think that pulled from, I think it pulled from some of the disparate community, sort of small weird community vibe that the internet used to have. And there's still some of those sites still exist. I mean, there's still like, I don't know if you know, like deviantart.com or something. I mean, it's still going.
But like, there are still, there's communities on Twitter, right? But the weird thing is now they're exposed to everyone else. Like your little sub community is in the same space that everyone else's community is in, and people are searching keywords, so they can come like attack your community whenever they want.
Right. Or like Reddit when you have all these like sub communities and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah,
it's just a different vibe.
Well, so how did you? So you're making, music for cell phone games
back in the day, yeah.
And then and then you're making chiptune music. How did that come? How did you get from there to doing music for games that people who listen to this podcast have heard of, like Fez and Hyper Light Drifter? And
well, all of those things were kind of they were disconnected from each other. Like when I started doing cell phone games, I don't even know if I was doing chiptunes yet. Like I was just playing guitar and like recording like demos in GarageBand with like shitty fake drums and distorted guitars and stuff. But I was also like I had discovered software that allowed me to like very quickly like get my ideas down, basically like guitar tablature software. where you input a bunch of numbers and you save it as like a file, and then you can just play it back with like, MIDI sounds. But it's like a chart, and it has like your fingerings and all that kind of stuff. And I originally used that to save guitar ideas because that's what it's designed for. But I got really comfortable with it, and I started like, writing songs in it. And that was how I got the MIDI, like the cell phone game gig. And, like getting into that and like GarageBand, I was getting frustrated with like trying to record everything and like produce it. And I didn't know how to like mix or like use compressors or any of this kind of stuff. So I kind of just like, I stumbled into, like synthesizers, basically, like really simple synthesizers. And I was like, this is really easy and it sounds cool. And that kind of set me off on this tangent of like doing chiptunes, especially with like getting involved in those communities and stuff. And so I just like, I put all of my creative energy into making chiptune music for quite at least 5 or 6 years.
Oh, wow.
Maybe longer. And I kept doing it while doing other stuff too. But I was doing that, and then I went away to music school to Berkeley in Boston. And that exposed me to, a bunch of other stuff. I didn't know that I was going to write music for games as a career. I just thought this was like a crazy lucky break, basically.
Right.
The cell phone thing. But I discovered there was like a group of like-minded people at Berkeley who, there was a video game music club. So there was like a community there, people who were interested in games and maybe working in games. And so, I found out about events and stuff and started going to like game developer meetups and like conferences, finding out about internships. I did 2 internships when I was at Berkeley.
Oh, wow. So at this point, are you like, hey, this is, video game music is like this is a profession?
It's a viable career path, potentially, yeah.
Yeah.
Thinking about music and also sound design, maybe. Just like learning about the industry and what people do. But also like discovering new communities, like discovering like the independent games community.
Right.
Which was like it was like very, when I became familiar with that scene, it wasn't really that well connected to the chiptune scene, but they're like natural. Yeah. They're like a natural kind of like a relationship there, especially for people who are doing like, kind of fun, just free hobby sort of projects, like
right.
with pixel art and stuff. Like it's pulling from the same,
goes together perfectly.
Yeah, the same place. They're both sort of like, they're kind of contemporizing old stuff, deconstruction, that kind of thing. So, yeah, I just sort of had these different things going. Like the whole time I was doing chiptune stuff, and I started performing live with guitar and like backing tracks. And I had this like moniker, Disasterpeace, which I came up with when I was a teenager. And so I was just releasing original music with that. But I was also in college, and I was like trying to think about my career. And so I was starting to do internships and some small like freelance gigs as Rich Vreeland, just as my name. And at some point I felt like maybe I should just like combine all of this into one thing and just try to just try to find a way to think about what I'm doing as an artist, which is, it's not always easy to do that, when you're trying to like, you're just kind of like taking what comes because you have to work on whatever. That may not always, like align with what you really want to do or how you see like the art that you're trying to do. But I just like really tried to keep converging sort of like the work, like the challenges and like the requirements of like doing this for work and my like artistic desires into like a singular thing. And so there was like, I was doing like casual game music and stuff like that, but I was also doing like indie game stuff, like games for competitions, like game jams, these sort of like hobby games that, you would develop in a couple weeks or a couple days.
Right.
And I would just like, hey, you need some music. And some people in that community were also familiar with chiptunes. So sometimes they'd be like, oh yeah, I've heard your stuff before. And so I kind of like leaned into that. And over time, all of this stuff just started to congeal into like a ball, basically like colliding all these different sort of like interests into like a singular thing and like trying to build momentum into like a career.
That's like, I've never heard the process of, like creating a career or a brand is the wrong word, but like sort of taking yourself seriously as a sort of creative artist is, you have to like make that step into the world where you're not like, okay, I got my day job, I got my hobby or whatever.
Right.
You got to like combine both of those things and say like, no, like I'm the product, like I'm the whole package right here, and like I'm on this trajectory that combines my work and my and what I'm interested in and all these things into one bundle, so that they're all focused at like the same goal, but they can also suck in like everything that you do.
Right.
I'm having a really hard time articulating.
No, I mean, that's pretty much what it was. And like, even like graphic design, which is something that I've always been interested in, like even though I dropped out of college to do that, I mean, I still do graphic design. I still do web development. Like, but I do it for myself,
Yeah.
So I just have like a really like cool website now.
Yeah.
I don't have to think about it all the time, but I can do like, my own album art or whatever. Everything just sort of like, I tried to just like congeal everything into kind of a singular path. And it takes time. Like, unless you're really lucky, you can't just like decide, I'm going to like, I'm going to combine these like very utilitarian like requirements, like having a job and like, my art. And just like put it together, and like now it works. Like,
right.
I had to work on a bunch of stuff for a while before I feel like I got lucky basically, like to work on something that did well, and then I could I had a little bit more breathing room basically to be selective about what I did.
It's almost like, what it actually made me realize is this is the thing I was trying to put a point on, which is that like as a comedian, as a comic, you got to step over that barrier of thinking of yourself as like, okay, I got a day job, and then at night like I'm trying to do open mics, or whatever,
right.
And instead be like, no, I'm this person like all the time, like I'm the comic all the time, like you're getting you're getting Adam Conover like every single time I walk in the room, even if when I'm at my day job, like I'm a comedian at my day job who's like waiting to go do the thing at night, and like that was, I remember, it was the first time I've ever labeled that step, but now I remember going through that transition distinctly. That's really cool. How did you end up working on Fez?
So Fez, I was doing live shows at that point for a few years, and I was up in Boston, and I was part of a little scene there of people doing chiptune stuff, and we wanted to start doing shows in other cities, and we knew the people. There was a community in Montreal, and they invited us up there to play, and so we took a road trip to Montreal and played up there, and one of the developers for Fez was at the show, and I met him, and we had a nice conversation, and he was interested in having me work on the game, and they were actually pushing for like a compilation sort of style soundtrack, but I tried to convince them to hire me, and it worked. It worked out.
Was that like, so I think of that as being, the first project of yours that like really made me sit up and take notice. Is that for you? That was my first big thing, or?
Yeah, as far as like career stuff goes, it was like winning the lottery, basically.
Really?
Well, because it was a game that, and I had worked on some things that were like, I don't know, like I was doing okay. Like I was working on stuff, and I was, making ends meet for the most part. But that game was already in development for years, and it was a really novel sort of concept. It had a really big sort of hype factor.
Yeah.
It was a game that I knew about, and I was excited to play.
Yeah.
So when I got the opportunity to work on it, I was, it was really motivating for sure. And it just, as far as like creative processes go, it was one of the smoothest projects I've ever worked on, and we'll probably never work on something that went as easily as that did. And I don't really understand why. It just like for whatever reason, it's just one of those projects where this is super rare, but like the first or second sketch or like kind of concept that you have for like what the thing is going to sound like, it just clicked, and it was kind of a simple kind of like recipe for creating stuff. And so and it was kind of like a style of music that I hadn't really done too much of, but was always interested in. So I had a lot of like energy to kind of push in that direction.
How do you describe that style of music in that game?
I would describe it as like ambient electronic, but it's kind of a contemporization of like a modern sort of take on like chiptunes.
Yeah.
With kind of like a cinematic flair.
Yeah.
And then just like pulling like different references or different inspirations for like making melodic music, which for me at the time was like probably mostly like other video games and film music, impressionism, like Debussy and Ravel, like Satie, and like jazz, maybe some jazz.
Yeah.
And it was just the kind of project where I could just kind of sit down and like play some chords or whatever, and I was like, oh, that could be a thing.
Yeah.
And I'd also started like kind of like collecting ideas that I wouldn't use on other projects. I just like, oh, I don't have a place for this. I'll just save it for later. And I ended up using like 6 or 7 of those to be tracks, basically.
Wow. So just like little bits of tab or like melodies,
yeah, exactly.
or
like a little
whatever.
bit of tab or like a little like voice recording or something.
Yeah.
Like I would just like dust it off and but I would be like, I would be actively looking for things like there might be like a level or like an environment or something. And I'm like, I don't really feel like writing today. What maybe something that I did before like would work for this, and I would just like look at the level and like just play, go through my library of old ideas and be like, oh, that's perfect.
So I'm so curious about the process by which one goes about writing game music. I mean, first of all, are they giving you style notes, a mood, that sort of thing?
They can. I mean, it really varies. Like on a project like Fez.
Let's talk about that project. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it was like just. I think we had a very brief conversation up front about what Phil Fish, the director, liked, and it was kind of like he liked sort of the sparseness of like a Fallout game. He claims to have mentioned Vangelis. I don't remember if we talked about Vangelis or not. A lot of people said later that it's reminded them of Vangelis. So I'm like,
yeah,
I'm a
it does.
little hesitant to say that was like intentional because I don't know.
Yeah.
But I went back and wrote something, and it was this track Adventure that made it into the. We didn't actually use it in the game, but we used it in the credits. Sent it to him, and he loved it. And but we talked about we should like do something like this, but do something more ambient. Like it's probably too crazy to have like up-tempo music the whole time. So it came together really fast, and it was the kind of project where I would say like 98% of the time I just write something and put it in a level, and we just had like this sort of wavelength that we were on, which is it's not all the time or super common. It's just one of those projects where it really clicked.
Wow.
And there have been a lot of projects where that has been much, much harder.
Yeah.
For sure.
I can imagine.
Yeah.
I think like that's first of all, Fez is one of my favorite games ever.
Awesome.
And it really it really gets to me on like a bunch of different levels. Like from the I felt like just in terms of the level design and those sorts of elements, I was like, this game is like speaking to me. Like like it's like this is. I was like, I feel like I had the same experiences in life as the people who made this game or something.
Right.
Like it was like really, it was this direct sort of communication, and then the meticulous nature of like just the the design of each of the levels of the pixel art and everything is it was very, very emotional game for me to play. The music is maybe the most powerful part of the game in that way. Like it really just sets the tone of each of the levels in such a direct way. The game is very broadly set in, sort of like a ruined world, or like a place that was once great and now is not. And that comes across in the music so clearly. Like to me anyway, I'm like, this is clearly nostalgic, melancholy music about the past. And I guess
Totally.
my question was that your intention going in, and how does one go about evoking that mood if that is your intention?
Yeah, it was definitely the intention to create that sort of vibe. I think we kind of stumbled onto it. I think there was a lot of just intuiting. How do we approach that feeling? And ultimately, it was a matter of I think we knew we wanted it to be sparse. And I know I wanted it to be cinematic because I just got that feeling. And so, that ended up being the sort of like ambient melodic sort of music. And then, you tie in sort of the aesthetic of the game, like the pixel art. I knew that I wanted to do a contemporary sort of take on kind of a classic video game feel, but not sort of like classic video game music.
Yeah.
Do something more contemporary and just pulling from other influences.
Yeah, it has that feeling. It's recognizable as video game music, but it's not chiptunes. It's not, or strictly speaking, it's not like strictly backwards looking. It's like that that synthesis.
And to be fair, like all the old video game music was pulling from contemporary influences.
Oh yeah.
Also, I mean like. It's hard for me to like listen to like a Mega Man soundtrack without thinking of like Iron Maiden or something.
I still hear pieces of music that I realize, oh my God, this is what a video game song I loved was based on. Like when I finally saw, I believe, the Sergio Leone movie Once Upon a Time in the West. There's a Morricone track on that's Cheyenne's theme. That the first time I heard it, I was like, "This is Shadow's theme from Final Fantasy VI." Like it was like so clearly an homage, and it was like it was like figuring out an homage in reverse because the movie is 20 or 30 years older than the game, and that still happens to me. Like
there's some really serious ones. There's one from Chrono Trigger. It's like the forest music, and it's a song called JoJo, maybe. I'll have to look it up, and I can send it.
I remember hearing once like a even like with Mario music, like which is a lot of his like ragtime, hearing like a specific piece of ragtime where I was like, this is the one that like that one world was based on, where it was so clear that they must have heard this piece specifically. Anyway, so it's a good point. I mean, it's not as though that stuff was made in some cultural vacuum either.
I just think things that I was inspired by that it impacted the music like harmonically and stylistically and stuff were not necessarily things that I heard in a lot of like classical video game music.
Yeah, like what?
I don't think I'd heard a lot of like impressionistic like music inspired by impressionism in video games before.
Yeah.
Like I think here and there, but not a ton. And so I think that was a pretty big like touchstone for me, especially at that time, because that was like the thing that I had just discovered. And then like minimalism was another style that I had just kind of come across at that time, like Steve Reich.
Yeah.
And that was kind of there's a fair bit of that as well in the soundtrack.
Yeah, now it's really funny because I've listened to it so many times, but and I'm familiar with all of those composers, and it's like, oh yeah, I do see that now.
Yeah.
Are you like so much of the music in the game gives the feeling, like it's what makes it feel sort of mysterious and grand, right? Like if it wasn't for the music, or if it was like, lights, if it was a different soundtrack, you would think like, okay, I'm playing like some little goofy platformer about a world that can rotate, like la-di-da, and maybe you would, quit a little bit sooner. But because of the music, I had the feeling of like, oh my God, something much bigger is happening here, my smallness is in relation to some mystery I can't understand yet, and I want to push through and like find out what that is. It would give you that sense of a world. And what's interesting about that is that, like, I assume, I don't know what it's like to make music at all, but most of the time you're making music that isn't meant to accompany anything in particular. It's just, hey, someone's going to put it on their record player or whatever, and maybe it'll make them feel a certain way, and you have really no control over that. But when you're making video game music, it's accompanying a specific activity.
Right.
How much are you thinking about, well, I'm trying to make the player feel a certain way with the music in relation to their game experience?
I think there was probably maybe a quarter to a third of the music I did that, where I sat down to write music for a particular situation. But that's really hard to get it right. It requires a lot of like back and forth and sort of like massaging, or you just get lucky and you kind of stumble into it, I think. So a technique that I relied on quite a bit is to write music generally, especially early on, just to write music generally that's inspired by the game itself and sort of like the general vibe of what I want the game to feel like. And then find places for those pieces as I'm playing, like thinking about, what kind of music would work here? And then what have I written? And kind of like comparing and like contrasting those things and be like, oh, I think this would work really well here and this would work. It's kind of like a puzzle, or I kind of approach it like a puzzle. And then you add in like using sort of like the preconceived sketches and stuff that I had, listening to those and thinking about like what might work in this project. That opened it up for me quite a bit to, kind of pull, like mix and match and pull things and be like, oh yeah, this would be good for here and this might work well for here. And that helped make the project move along consistently, because it can be really difficult to kind of hone in on like a particular vibe. Like when you're trying to express a very particular emotion, it can be pretty difficult.
Yeah. Well, I wonder if the fact that you did it in that loose way is sort of what makes the soundtrack to that game powerful. Because I mean, I played a lot of games where it's like, okay, it's the machine level, and we've got the machine music,
And there's some of that, like that definitely helps. That makes it a little easier. Like there's a graveyard world in the game, and I knew that I wanted to like mimic weather. Like that was just kind of like the high concept I had for that area, is like I want to do something that sounds like a thunderstorm. Right. So, that was like kind of a very technical way of writing, because I knew that it would be simple. It would be like these big like thunderous chords, and then there'd be like these little like little like raindrop kind of sounds. And so that's what I did. And I think because the structure of it matches a thunderstorm so closely, it kind of like does the work for you. Like it's not about like, kind of stumbling your way through like reaching this sort of abstract goal. Like you know what I mean? Like it's much more like clearly defined because it's attached to an actual structure. Mm-hmm. And then like even going beyond that and having the music like be somewhat random and like changing, like a thunderstorm would change, like the time between like thunder strikes is sort of random. And also there's a flash on screen when the thunder hits, right? Am I right about that? Yeah, but the music and the music doesn't actually like sync to that. It does a different thing. Oh, really? So that it's not like, in my memory it syncs. Well, that's good. Because like, I guess I didn't want to like break the fourth wall or whatever. Yeah. Is it the fourth wall or the third wall? I don't know. One of those walls. I don't know how many walls there are in video games. Break the fourth wall is correct in comedy, or in television. Right. I didn't want to like too closely tie it. I mean, that's something that I've done later on in other projects, because it's interesting to do that. But I think I wanted to keep it underscore, so it's not like tied to it directly. But got it. It all just kind of, I think it all just kind of, contributes to kind of the cacophony of
That's the next thing I wanted to ask about, because one of the things that I'm not going to say you're the first person to do it. You're probably not, but I first noticed it in your work of the sort of like dynamic composing where things are, it's not one track that's repeating.
Definitely not the first.
Yeah, I'm sure not the first. But that it's responding to things that are happening in the game, or like you said, happening sort of randomly. What is it like to write that way? I mean, are you sort of are you doing chunks and then sort of saying, okay, they're going to come in and out programmatically, or are you almost, is it more like you're making a procedurally generated song? How do you think about it?
Yeah. Well, making procedural generated song is really hard. Making procedurally generated music is easier. But it doesn't usually have a structure.
I get.
You know what I mean?
A song has a structure, and music doesn't necessarily. True.
But on Fez, I mean, and on other projects, there's a lot of different structures that you can use that are, that accomplish different things. Like the structure that I described for the graveyard is one kind of thing. We had music for like puzzle levels, which was made up of all these different individual elements that were different lengths. So you might have like one instrument that plays for like 1 bar, and another one that plays for 1.5 bars, and there were maybe like 6 or 7 of these, and so they would all kind of like trigger semi-randomly, and they would overlap in different ways to kind of keep it from feeling too repetitive or grounded, and to kind of give it this sort of air of mystery, which was like in my head, it was like a way to like thematically tie the music to how it's being used, like as puzzle music. And then the music also changes like key over time of day, which is not something that you would notice because it's all the puzzles are all indoors for the most part. But it was just a piece of tech that was there, and it was like, oh, this is a cool way to like have the music change over time.
By the real time day, or like the day-night cycle in the game?
The day-night cycle in the game.
Got it.
Yeah.
And when you're composing in that way, are you yourself programming how the interaction is going to happen, or are you sending a bunch of bits and pieces over to Phil and saying like, hey, I think we should stitch them together this way and send me back the next build?
Well, I've done my fair share of programming over the years, but on Fez, the lead programmer, Renaud, he built me a tool to that would just do all these different sort of like musical things, like with individual elements, like kind of moving them around in time, or like making changes based on time of day, or making changes based on altitude, all these different sorts of things.
Wow.
And so, he built this tool for me to use to kind of empower me to do all this stuff myself, which was great because I could just kind of, load up the game and, conceive of an idea with the tools in mind, and then like, render out all the files and like load them into the level and like test it myself and then commit the changes, and then the next day, get an email like, oh, I heard the music you added for this area, and like I really like it. Or
oh wow, so you're just committing straight to the like the whatever the version
control.
Yeah,
call it. Yeah,
that's wild.
Yeah.
Is that how you normally work in general?
I think maybe at that point it wasn't as common. I think it's way more common now for musicians to do that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Because I think there's just, I think in general, people are expected to know these things more, and it's easier. Like the barrier is lower. So I think, yeah.
It's just so, it's so different from like my workflow in like TV, where it's, there's as many people working on a TV show, but no one actually has the power to put anything in the final thing. Everyone's just emailing their work to somebody else, and then finally the editor sequences it all together. You know what I mean? Right. So it's such a funny idea to be like, oh yeah, you would just commit it, and then later they'd like come across and be like, oh neat, you know, in the next build.
Well, I mean, at least like you wouldn't necessarily have the keys to the castle. Like, it's not like you have, I mean, sometimes you might be given the keys as far as like, you load up the code or whatever, and you're committing code changes to the code. But this is more like, here's a text file, plug this stuff in.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like you're not like in danger of like
Yeah.
deleting the game or whatever. But I mean, that is also a thing. That's something that you usually earn the trust of your collaborators to be allowed to do that.
Yes, of course. So you went on to compose for It Follows and for Hyperlight Drifter, and I have noticed that you sort of have a little bit of a signature sound. Would you say that's fair to say? To a certain extent?
I think there's definitely some carryover. With between Fez and It Follows and Hyperlight. It's something that I've been like actively trying to fight. I mean, there are certain elements of it that I think are just a part of my style. But like last year, I actually did another film with the director of It Follows.
Oh, cool.
We finished it, and we got into the Cannes Film Festival. So
oh, wow.
I'm going there next week.
What's it called?
Under the Silver Lake.
Under the Silver Lake. Okay,
Yeah.
watch for Under the Silver Lake.
And that's an orchestra, 48-piece orchestra score.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's awesome. I can't wait to hear that.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think stylistically there certainly will be some carryover. But, I mean, like It Follows, people called that a chiptune score, which was like, it's not really a chiptune score. I mean, I don't think people are going to call this a chiptune score.
Yeah. Well, I wouldn't either. It's funny. I did not see It Follows because I don't watch horror movies.
I don't either.
and I know it's man, I want to see it, but I'm just like, I probably will break down and see it one of these days. But to prep for this interview, I was like, okay, I actually want to hear the score, and I was listening to it, and the score is fucking terrifying. First of all, but also I was like, oh, I hear this like same sort of like hero instrument to a certain extent. It had a little bit of that same like degraded, feeling from Fez, where it's like, okay, I'm sort of hearing a chiptune, but it's like, someone didn't blow on the cartridge, or there's a little bit of like crackle and breakdown there. And I was wondering where that came from. And I'm sorry I don't mean to label you as, you do this something that you're moving away from. But.
No, it's fine. I mean, the reality of that is that the director and editor who temped the score used a bunch of my music from Fez.
Oh.
And so
got it.
It was this kind of unusual situation where it put me in a little bit of a strange position to be there. So I tried, there are like probably 4 or 5 or 6 cues in the movie that were temped with Fez cues, and I tried to like do something different on all of those.
They were like, we like the old thing.
Well, yeah, some of them it worked out better than others. Like some of them I was able to do something that I felt like is different and new enough. Like I don't know, you probably won't know because you just listened to it like today or whatever, but
I'm sorry.
It's okay. There's one track that's like really similar to a Fez cue because I tried so many different things, and he just kept going back to the temp, which is like a common thing with doing film and TV. Working with directors, they call it temp love.
Yeah, I've been there. I mean, a lot of times, you just stick in stuff where it's like, oh, it should sound like this.
Yeah. And
me and my sketch group made a movie, and we put this is so stupid. Whoever tempted in put in a Hall & Oates "You Make My Dreams Come True" for this like music montage, and it was like, well, we need something that's that good, and of course, there's like no piece of music that any human could make that like gives you exactly the feeling that you want to get from Hall & Oates, "You Make My Dreams Come True." It's such a singular piece of music, and it was like impossible to. Jesse actually did something that was very, very good, but when I watch it, I still like have that in the back of my head. Yeah.
As a composer, you have to pray and hope that you're working with someone who has the ability to let go of whatever it is that they've grown attached to and can appreciate something that's different. I think like working to temp music has been generally really positive experience for me because it forces me to like interface with all different kinds of music that I didn't know before. Like this film that we just did, it's inspired by like film noir. So a lot of the temp was like film noir scores, which is something that I didn't have a lot of familiarity with. So it put me in a very different headspace than I'm used to being in. And so I think, I was able to utilize that to get to some places musically that I never would have otherwise. It's just that on It Follows, that was also a new experience, like being asked to riff on your own music is super weird.
Yeah, so was the director just like a Fez fan, or?
Yeah, he played the game, and that's how he found me.
Incredible.
Yeah, I almost said no like a few times because of scheduling and stuff, and I wasn't sure. Like I read the script, and I was like, I wasn't sure. It had a different ending, and I wasn't sure about the ending, but it all worked out.
You give notes to the director on hey man, I'll come on, but I want you to change the ending.
I don't remember. Maybe.
Yeah. Is there a difference in just, pursuant to what we were talking about, composing for a particular feel for the player? I mean, a film must be so much more like that, where it's like you're really trying to get across something very specific.
Yeah.
How did that feel by comparison?
It's more moment to moment. So
Yeah.
you're trying to create sort of like a tapestry and like a geography, like a narrative of moment to moment sort of beats and ideas. And so I got into the habit on this most recent project of like taking notes at times like segments. So like on It Follows, I think the cues were a little simpler and they usually were only evoking one idea. So I would just listen to the temp and I'd be like, okay, this track is kind of evoking this feeling, or I just kind of like internalize that feeling and then forget the music and just kind of like try to recreate something with that feeling in mind that would hopefully be new and not too similar. But on this project, there's a lot more music that's like changing and it's like under conversations. So, there's like different emotions involved. And so I just got into this habit of like just taking notes, like, okay, in this section, it's kind of this thing. And in this section, it's like this thing. And just like, I would forget the temp cue, but then I would have this timeline basically that has all these like points in time that are like evoking these like different phrases that I wrote down that are just kind of these like, these sort of like blurry ideas about what music should be. They'd have like, emotion words in them, or like timbral words, like, shiny or, or, just some like particular thing about it that I felt like is like essential to what it's doing.
Right.
Yeah, it's a very different experience writing music that way. It's kind of like a puzzle, a different kind of puzzle than a game would be, where like a lot of music in games, you're either trying to do moment to moment, like on Hyperlight Drifter, you're moving around so much that you can't really capture moment to moment with a piece of music like over time. Like it's really hard to like have like dun, 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 whatever, some kind of melody or something, and then you go over here and the melody changes to that. Like that's pretty tough to do. I mean, you can do it.
Yeah.
Austin Wintory, who did the soundtrack to Journey and like
Right.
Abzu, he does that pretty well. I find it pretty difficult to do that. Like on Hyperlight, we would just have short pieces of music that would just have a lot of different versions of the same piece, and depending on where you were, the music would have a different feeling. And so it's more about capturing like a broader feeling. I think for me, I always found that music that has like a particular mood to it, like modal music is like a kind of music that, it kind of lives in one place. It kind of creates a certain like mood or environment that you can kind of like inhabit, as opposed to like, like a John Williams score or something, which is like, it's like a crazy like narrative adventure that's like hits all these different moments and beats.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, that's sort of where video game music, like a lot of video game music, used to live there. Like that was pretty common, and that works in a certain way because it's an adventure.
Yeah.
But if you're trying to capture like a setting or like a certain emotion, like something more nuanced than that.
Yeah.
It helps to like kind of pull back a lot of the complexity and like focus in on something more simple. Like a couple of chords or like a simpler idea. And so that's like a pretty big distinction. I mean, because you could do that in film too, but I think in games, it aligns itself differently.
It's really what that reminds me of is I played Ni no Kuni on the PS3 a couple of years ago, and I love that game so much. And the score is by
Joe Hisaishi.
Yeah, who's the Studio Ghibli composer, who I love his work so much, and I loved his music in that game, but I specifically remember reading other people's complaints about like the battle music needs to calm down,
Battle music, yeah.
Yeah, it just like and that's actually almost traditional in JRPGs of like battle music that's like really like got a fucking theme song to it.
There's always different layers though. There's like there's like the common encounter, which is usually like lighter, and then there's like the crazy battle, like boss battle.
But it's got that sort of John Williams feel that you were talking about, where it's like there's like this crazy. It could like be scoring Star Wars.
Super elaborate music, but it's kind of written in like a laboratory. That's like it's kind of detached from the game, and then he kind of like you can kind of tell that like he wrote a bunch of really cool music. That's like inspired by the game, and then they kind of like threw it in there. And I think you can do that, but I think it's helpful to have an editor when you do that who can like chop it up, and make it a little bit more a little bit more dynamic.
I remember what you were. I mean, one of the moments I remember most from Hyper Light Drifter, which is another game I adore, but was like, coming into an area and enjoying the music, and then coming across like this big like sort of titan, like huge giant like head or hand or something, with this giant scenic thing, like this big dead giant, and just another layer coming into the music really powerfully. I think the reason it stuck with me and gave me a curiosity was it felt like a perfectly scored moment. Like it felt like I was watching a movie, and like the camera revealed the big, I don't know, the big dead monster that or the scary thing that the people are seeing for the first time, and there's a cue to match it, and it's like this deep rumble you've never heard before, and that's like exactly what happened in the game, and it accentuated the moment so much, but. It sounds like you're saying like, well, you can't really design for that. It just sort of happened to me, or what?
Well, I mean, we designed it in a way that we could get away with that without actually like knowing, without musically knowing how to change the music in a over time sense. Like the music is not changing like chords or something. Well, that whole section, you're ascending this like snowy mountain, and basically what you're getting different versions of the same piece of music. It's like a 2-minute piece of music or something. It's like the exact same piece of music, but there's like 4 or 5 different versions of it, and they're produced differently, and they use different sounds, and some of them have slightly different elements. And so, as you move towards that Titan, the big old robot guy, and you have that reveal, you're basically, what you're hearing is you're hearing a calmer version of the music fading out, and a much more intense version of the music fading in.
But they're like matched, like they play in sync with each other.
Right, exactly.
So you just sort of fade from one to the other, and you know that no matter when that happens, you'll be at the same spot.
Right. It should always sound pretty good. Like it's never going to be like this pointed, like like whatever. But
it always sounds good when the bass comes in.
Smooth, yeah.
Exactly. In terms of just when you were saying that like doing Fez was like winning the lottery, like doing It Follows is also like a real breakout movie, Yeah,
that was different though, because we had no idea that it was going to be such a big deal.
Really?
Well, the director had only done one other feature. And it did okay. Like it was at Cannes, in I think like a side. I can't remember if it was in the competition or not. I'm not sure. But I mean, I think David was a relatively unknown director. I was not super familiar with him either. And it was a very small budget across the board. And we kind of did it on the seat of our pants. I mean, I wrote that score in like 3 weeks.
Wow.
Like, it was really crazy. And yeah, we were all really surprised, pleasantly surprised at how well it did. So that was like the big distinction there. But it was certainly it was certainly like a really lucky sort of like big break for me to be able to have another success of like, in a different medium.
Yeah.
Which is like, I think, really unusual. Like, I feel really fortunate that happened because I don't think that there aren't many composers who do a lot of games and film. Like, there's very few that I know of. Everyone's got a different story, but yeah, I mean, it opened up a lot of opportunities for me for sure.
Yeah.
But it's like anything, you kind of have to navigate it. And so like after I did It Follows, pretty much all of the opportunities were like, we want you to do this like horror movie, except it's like 10 times more gruesome than It Follows. I was like, I don't even really like horror movies that much. So
yeah.
I had to kind of like, I had to bide my time and like pick and choose my battles. And I turned down a couple of big things. And
any that I would know that you can
yeah, for sure.
You don't have to say what they are.
Stranger Things.
Oh wow.
Ghost in the Shell.
Holy shit.
To name a few.
So what I mean, so I did actually have that question because I felt that, just looking at your work, I was like, okay, you must be in demand, but it seemed that you must be pretty selective.
Yeah.
Was a thought. And so what led to you saying no to those?
It was just like kind of taking in all the information and like both externally and internally and like trying to make the best decision. Like Stranger Things was, I was in the middle of a couple of projects. I didn't have a lot of time.
Mm-hmm.
And I liked the script. But originally it was set in Long Island. And I just thought that was so weird.
I'm from Long Island.
I'm from Staten Island.
Ah.
I don't know. I mean, that was just one thing. Like they had also sent me their feature. They had sent me the feature that they had done.
Yeah.
And I didn't like it. So
yeah.
And I felt bad, but
But tell them it's because it was from Long Island. It'll help them save face. I don't like it because it's set on Long Island. I don't like that.
Yeah.
They'll be like,
I don't
what?
know.
This guy's weird. Okay, whatever.
I hope I didn't burn that bridge. But yeah, I don't know. What was I gonna say? Yeah, I didn't know that it was gonna be. I mean, great for them. I didn't know it was gonna be such a big deal.
Yeah,
that just happened afterwards. But there was a period of time where it was pretty weird. Seeing it everywhere. But yeah, I mean, there was also sort of like the aesthetic that they were going for. It's like very nostalgic. And
yeah.
I've always kind of had like a conflicted relationship with like doing nostalgic sort of work.
Yeah.
Like it's kind of. I feel like there's a way of being nostalgic that that resonates with me, and there's a way of being nostalgic that I struggle with.
Completely agree.
And I don't know. It felt a little ham-fisted to me personally. Yeah. And that's just a personal opinion.
Yeah, I didn't like. I didn't watch Stranger Things, and people were like, "You should love this," and we all love it. And I was like, "I don't like what I'm hearing about it." Just the same reason I didn't see Ready Player One. I was like, I think I know what this is trying to do for me, and you know what? Pass. I wanted to be a little more subtle than that, or something.
Yeah, it just didn't feel very nuanced to me. It felt kind of like blatant.
There's a reason to, and I don't want to. And again, I'm not criticizing something I haven't seen, but there's a reason I played Fez, and like I still haven't played Axiom Verge. Like I got the same vibe from that game where I'm like, well, no, I want someone. I would love to play a game by someone who is like referencing this thing and like, using this thing from my past that I love, but I don't want just another one of the old thing. I want like a new piece of art that like synthesizes the lessons and like learns from them. I don't want fan fiction, you know.
It's a difficult line, and
nothing wrong with fan fiction.
Yeah, there's nothing wrong with it. I think it's just a different taste.
Yeah.
Some people.
Yeah.
For some people, I don't think they mind. The thing being closer to the inspirations. Yeah. I think for me personally, I like. there's like a certain level of deconstruction that I'm seeking, and I mean,
Yeah.
you know, my feelings about whether something is doing that or not are totally subjective, but that's just like how I felt about that.
Well, something someone told me about Stranger Things, and it's stuck with me since, and it's true of everything I do like as well, is that what makes something successful, or at least a good reason for Netflix to buy something, right?
Yeah.
Is a property that is, or a work that is simultaneously familiar and new. So it's like
conservative and
yeah, exactly.
risk taking at the same time.
Yeah, and I think whatever I read, sort of made that was criticizing Stranger Things a little bit, but also that's true of everything that you like, and that's
Well, and I think it came off the heels. I mean, I think the timing of it too, like it came off the heels of It Follows, and I think It Follows was very successful on a critical and like cult level, but maybe not as successful like in pop culture or mainstream. And for me personally, like I didn't want to get sort of like pigeonholed as sort of like a horror style composer, and there were like just personal things like I wanted to do something different, and maybe it wasn't different enough for me at that particular time.
So what made you say yes to Hyperlight Drifter? Because I mean, when I played that game, I was like, my main thought about that game is that it seems incredibly personal to me, even more so than Fez, and it plays in many of the same streams that Fez does in a lot of ways. Your involvement being one of them, but yeah,
it's definitely a more personal game.
Yeah,
it's interesting because there is a fair amount of overlap in those two games, but I think they're also managed to be like inherently different. For me, like the way that I made my way onto that project was through a friend who said that there was this creator who was trying to kickstart this game, and that I was their favorite composer. And I saw the game and I was like, I don't think I could say no to this project. It just looked really cool. And I, like a big part of a project for me is I have to define an agenda for myself. Like I'm always working within the confines of reality and what the project needs, but I need to figure out what's going to motivate me personally beyond that. And so on Hyperlight, I wanted to do something that was more kind of like, I don't know. Fez was very like melodic and kind of like thematic, kind of very forward. And Hyperlight is much more like, it's there, but I tried to be much more sort of like environmental, like with the music. Things are kind of like seeping into the environment in a different way, more like just more paced out. There's a lot more music in Hyperlight than there is in Fez. And it tends to be, there's a lot less melody. Like, I think that was one of the push and pulls that Alex and I had, Alex, the creative director, is that I didn't really want any melody in the whole game. But we kind of agreed on like, there were moments where we wanted to push it, moments that it could make it feel impactful. So we really sort of like, the music is very like, kind of like wispy and kind of like there, and then it's not there. And then it really comes forward like in pointed moments, like, that vista with the robot, or like boss battles, which are really, we try to make really over the top. But
it's true, it is even more ambient than Fez.
Yeah, so I just had to figure out like, how is this going to be different from Fez, and how can I make this, how can I don't want to say trick, but how can I convince myself that I'm like moving into new territory, which is like something that has always been a blessing or a curse, or maybe both. It's just like this obsession with like, I have to find the novelty in this project to like just to motivate myself, but also to like feel good about what I'm doing and feel like I'm not wasting my time.
Yeah. Who do you admire most in terms of, musically?
I don't know if there's anyone in particular. I think I find elements of different people at different times.
Yeah.
To be inspired by.
Fair enough. You know what? I'm sorry. When people ask me who my favorite comic is, I can't answer anymore. Like I used to be able to 5 years ago because there were people I was like, oh, that person's doing great work.
Yeah.
And now I'm like, I can still say Jon Stewart, but he's not doing it anymore,
Right.
So maybe that question is no good. I don't know.
That's okay. I mean, I think for me, part of like doing this is kind of engaging with like how I'm feeling at any moment and like what's interesting to me and like what's going on, and so that's always changing. Even like things that were like my favorite piece of music, favorite artist or whatever, like a couple years ago might not even be on my radar now. So it's hard to say, but I mean, there's certainly like styles of music and artists that were like really pivotal in like my formation as an artist. Early on, it was like the Beatles, being around that all the time, and like Vince Guaraldi, like the Peanuts music, like that sort of stuff was always around. So that was a really big part of my upbringing, and so that's not going anywhere. Or like a Joni Mitchell, like a Led Zeppelin, or like Tool, Rage Against the Machine. Like these are the things that like that's my youth. So
what a quick going from Joni Mitchell to Tool in the space of a couple words. Yeah.
Both great.
Yeah. Here's my last question. We have been going for a little while, but I'm very curious about this.
Sure.
I think something that is really, really interesting about video games is that there's the work of so many different artists that go into them, and so on this podcast so far I've been talking to the designers of the games, or the creative principle of the game, right? And that person is the sort of person who responsible and sort of receives the accolades for the game overall, right? Or who's seen as most responsible for the full package, right? But I always think about when I'm looking at a game and I'm like, my God, the person who animated this particular bit of animation, like what artistry is going into this, when just like, oh God, the character animations in Street Fighter 2, like that sort of like what pixel artist did this, right? And I think music is the most the one where that's most obvious, where the artistry is the most clear. That this is an art form that we appreciate by itself, but in scoring, whether be it for video games or movies, it's part of a bigger artwork. Yeah. And so I'm wondering, I don't work that way. I'm the creative principal on my show, right? I have artists working for me who art department editors, et cetera. But I haven't had that experience myself. I'm wondering, what does that feel like about your relationship with the work, to have your work be a piece of a bigger work?
I feel like music has a very interesting role to play. I feel like it has this job. Typically, it has a job of like embodying the spirit, the soul, the heart, whatever you want to call it, of the project. Like what the essence of the project is. It really helps to humanize the project, which is interesting because music can be so kind of abstract and ethereal. Yeah. But it's as human as anything, and it's been around forever, and it's such a weird if you think about it, it's such a weird thing, because
music doesn't make any sense as an art form.
Doesn't seem like it has any utility at all. But it's kind of like, it's just a part of like I don't know, it's like it's just a part of the human story. I don't know. Yeah. It's interesting. It's an interesting role to play. And there have been times where I've been in situations where maybe I had more of an opportunity to steer the ship, or like contribute to sort of the overall like design of something. But that's not super common. And it's not something that's always super easy if you don't have that sort of inherent feel for that. I think a lot of times the role of the musician is to kind of like come in, at least for me, like this has been my experience. It's like the thing has already been in development, and there are already like a lot of high level ideas about what the thing is, and it's kind of your job to come in and like experience that and figure out like how to like transmogrify this thing into something even greater, or like how to tell the story that the product is trying to tell that hasn't been fully able to tell because it's like missing something, or it's lacking all of the tools to do it. And so I think it's like a really special role to play, and it can also be really difficult. It can be really emotionally taxing. And maybe that's not everybody, but that's certainly been my experience. Is it can be really emotionally draining to try to like embody sort of the spirit of something, especially if it's like something dark or like, whatever. Yeah. I've been kind of working that way for most of my career. You come in sort of late and you kind of like become the champion of the thing. It's like, well, I feel really, I'm really inspired by this thing, and I'm going to like riff on that and kind of like contribute to it. And yeah, it might be nice to be at the top and try to build something that way, because I haven't really done a whole lot of that at least in games. I haven't.
Yeah. What about like just in music,
Yeah, I mean, I've definitely done a lot of personal projects.
Yeah.
And yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's like I think in games it's so multifaceted. It's hard to like wrap my head around all the possibilities. With the music, I feel like I can, and maybe this is true in games too, but I feel like I can like have a high level idea about what something is, kind of establish like kind of general guidelines, and then I can work within those pretty well, whether or not I'm like the one directing it.
Yeah.
But with a game, there's like so many disciplines, and there's so much work that goes into making a game. It makes music seem trivial, honestly. Like game development is just the hardest.
Yeah.
It's the hardest thing. Like there's that law that I can't remember what it's called, but anything that you think is going to take this long, it's going to take twice as long. In games, It's like 4 times, I would say. It's usually 4 times as long as you think.
Yeah, I mean, when I feel like sometimes I have designers on and I'm asking, how do you do this? And they just don't even have an answer. They're like, I still can't wrap my mind around it.
It's a lot of stumbling into stuff, a lot of iteration, a lot of unforeseen problems. And it's so hard to estimate how things will pan out or how long things are going to take, because there's so many factors. It's so complex. There's so many disciplines, and it's such a complex multi-medium, that it's impossible to foresee all the things that will or will not happen.
Yeah.
So,
do you prefer that process of, coming in and championing the other person's project into, to like doing your own, work from scratch?
I really like both. I think there's a nice balance to be had doing both. I'm actually taking a little bit of a break right now, which I haven't taken a lot of breaks, and I think it's probably good for me to do that, because it can be taxing, taking on other people's projects and trying to embody those things. And I think to be good at it, I think requires a certain level of empathy.
Yeah.
Taking that stuff on is hard. So, I think that's part of why, like a lot of times in the past, I've sought out these more like kind of managerial or technical projects after a really intense one. Like after It Follows, I did this game called Mini Metro.
Oh yeah.
Which is
I love Mini Metro. I forgot that you worked on that.
Yeah.
Oh, Jesus.
That's like a procedural audio game, like Subway Simulation. It's like it was a very technical project, super fun. I didn't have any sort of the normal like emotional pitfalls that I experienced from writing music. Like it doesn't have the same stress where you're like, I don't know what this is and I'm freaking out.
Yeah.
Because it was just so new and different.
Yeah.
Like doing like music without writing any, like without making any like tracks or anything. It's all just like, code and individual pings, like individual notes. So, and I've done some like direction, like audio direction, like, have a team and kind of like dole out tasks and do support. But I really don't like managing people at all. So probably won't do that anymore.
It's not the most fun.
No,
I finally have people who I mean I have to manage people on my show, but I finally have people who manage the other people for me. So
Right.
I only manage one person.
I think I'm too nice. I think I'm too diplomatic. Like I like people to feel good and to like me. I don't like to be the bad guy. So.
Oh yeah, that's the curse. Well, hey man, that's all I got. Unless there's anything more, we've been talking for a while.
Yeah.
So, yeah. Well,
it's been fun.
Yeah. Thank you so much for coming by. I really appreciate
my pleasure.
it.
Yeah. It's been great.
Is there anything you'd like to plug? Or with Twitter or anything like that?
Yeah. I've got a film in the Cannes Film Festival. It's called Under the Silver Lake, and I did the music.
That sounds great.
And it's coming out in June.
If it's going to Cannes, people will be able to see it elsewhere, I assume.
Yeah, I think it's going to be released in June.
Awesome.
Here, so
I will see it.
Cool.
Thanks so much for being here.
My pleasure.
If you want to support the show, please subscribe and leave a rating on iTunes or wherever you listen to podcasts. You can follow me on Twitter at Adam Conover, sign up for my newsletter at adamconover.net, or follow me on Twitch at twitch.tv/Adam Conover. Thanks for listening. See you next time.
This podcast was brought to you by Starburns Audio and IGN. Produced by Noah Eberhart, engineered by Matt Brousseau, and executive produced by Jason Smith and Brian Baldinger. Listen to this podcast a day early using the Himalaya Podcast app, and don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review wherever you get your podcasts.